Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Denver Dzogchen podcast. I am Damian Abel, your host, and I'm here once again with Joseph Wagner. And today we are going to talk about the secret mantrayana in general and mantra practice in particular. I'm sure this is something that a lot of you are curious about, and me as well. It's a vast and interesting topic and a huge part of the Vajrayana vehicle, which is also sometimes called the Mantrayana vehicle. So, Joe, maybe you could just introduce us to the concept of mantra and what is it exactly? Are we casting a spell? Is it just a method of meditation? What is mantra?
Hi, Damien. Thank you. And hello, everyone. So happy we're doing this. I just want to say, it's just a pleasure for me to have to flex my understanding a little bit. It's very limited understanding. So to be able to bring that forth and stuff is good for me. And it's always nice to see you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Vajrayana, the path of the indestructibility, is also sometimes called mantrayana, like you said. And that means the vehicle of mantra. But what is mantra? Mantra, it has many different meanings, and I think it probably originated as in the context of a spell, a kind of incantation that brings about some sort of outcome. That was probably where it came from originally. But in our view, in our school, mantra is seen as the speech aspect of the deity. So let's say that you're supplicating Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, right? And in a mantra kind of a practice way, then you would try to unify your body, your speech, and your mind with the deity, such that the energy of that deity is manifest in you for the benefit of beings. So, you would, in a general context of Vajrayana, mantrayana, you would visualize yourself, you'd imagine yourself as the deity with 4 arms or 2 arms or whatever that particular style was. There are obviously many different practices. And you would, that would be the body aspect. You would imagine yourself as the body with light rays going out and purifying and benefiting others and so forth. And that's all part of regular sadhana practice. Your speech aspect would be to say the mantra of the deity, because the mantra is like this, the essence of the deity's vocalization, their breathing, which in this particular case would be Om Mani Padme Hum, maybe the most famous of all mantras. And then with your mind, you would rest in a union, to the degree that you're capable, of insight into the nature of reality, well, with a compassionate outflow, the compassion being the sort of essence of Avalokiteshvara. So on the one hand, you've got the body, which is the gross aspect of us, the most solid and physical part of us. And then on the other side, you've got the mind, which is the least physical, non-physical. The mantra is kind of both, right? You can hear it, but it doesn't have a physical form. It's got an energy, but it doesn't, you can't find it somewhere or, put it in a bottle. So from that perspective, mantra is a crossover between the body of the deity and the mind of the deity. And it's also a way of blessing and preserving our speech. Mantra is sometimes said to mean the protector of the mind. And so by reciting mantras, we're protecting our mind from having ordinary thoughts and ordinary ideas, as well as guarding our speech and then invoking the blessings of the deity the mantra's associated with.
Mm-hmm. And from what my understanding, there's basically 4 types of deities and mantras, which relate to the 4 activities. There's peaceful or pacifying, which is like Chenrezig, and then there's increasing, which would be like Jambala, like where you increase wealth or intelligence, like Manjushri. There's magnetizing, like Kurakule, or even Chenrezig is sometimes a mix of pacifying and magnetizing, which is like overpowering or drawing in. And then wrathful, which is like destroying, which would be like Vajrakalaya. So I'm wondering, when we're choosing what practice we do or what yidam we want to practice in general or what mantra we want to use today, maybe you want to talk about how you make those decisions and some of those effects.
Well, although, ultimately as practitioners, we kind of have to drive the boat of our practice. We have to decide what we're going to do. Well, that's true. It's really the teacher who sort of assigns the mantra. The teacher working with the student determines, okay, this person has such and such characteristics, and so this type of practice will be good for them or will allow them to flourish and pacify their negativities and increase their good qualities and head toward Buddhahood in that way.
Mhm.
So in terms of the four activities, there are these four tantric activities, and the most important one is, of course, pacifying. We're pacifying sickness, we're pacifying disturbing emotions. That is the very foundation, and peaceful practice and peaceful mantras are associated with that, like Om Mani Padme Hum, right? Avalokiteshvara's mantra. As you get into the more potent or intense activities, then there are certain practices that go with those. But these are usually done in the context of pacifying illness or negativity, increasing goodness and positivity and blessings and so forth. The third one, magnetizing, is really Wang subjugation, but that's all done in the context of uh, bringing beings into a field where they can flourish, which is one where there's maximum level goodness. And then the destroying activity is only done really by tantric masters and in special circumstances to destroy negativity primarily. It's not like aiming and wiping out your enemies. Really, in the early days of Mantrayana in Tibet, this was more common, which is one of the reasons that the Nyingma school, the ancient school, was still in place, but people went back to India to rejuvenate the Dharma because there was some thought, and this may or may not be historically true, that some of the Nyingma practitioners had gotten too much into this sorcery stuff. So we don't want to get too much thinking that, oh, I'm going to get into the Vajrayana, I'll be able to destroy my enemies and gather tons of money. This really depends more on your karma than how much practice you do, I think. But it is interesting, and they are associated. There are certain mantras associated with with these type of activities.
Does this resonate? So for me, I found that I think about the using the spectrum of these mantras not in an outer context, but in an inner context. So it's more to do with, if I need, like, if I keep having the same negative thoughts over and over, then that might be more of something needs to be pacified or purified. Or if I have sickness, if I don't have enough resources and money to practice and I'm having to work all the time, then calling on Lord Jambala might be a good way to help me have the resources to do my practice, or if I do Manjushri practice because I'm having a hard time understanding the Lamrim text I'm studying, or I might do the magnetizing because I want to help those around me come into line with the Dharma and become more loving and compassionate, so that they are benefited. And then, like wrathful, like when I'm having a particular habit or emotion that I'm really struggling with, I might bring in that kind of activity. So is that one way we could approach these kind of activities?
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of looking at it from the perspective of beginner practitioners, but once you're established, then you have the Vajrayana, more than other schools of Buddhism, seems to have a more vast and deep toolbox. And so you do have different tools you can use for different circumstances, right? And just like you said, it's really an internal, we're dealing with our internal landscape more than the outer landscape. These days, I don't know if it's scientific materialism being the number one world philosophy or what, but the real power of these things to alter outside circumstances, it seems more limited than it was perhaps in the past. And that could be because people were more open to it. Their minds were not as busy. So the focus probably hasn't ultimately changed, but it's really about our internal landscape. And just like you said, and once you have received the various, in order to recite certain mantras, you need a transmission, right? There's usually three aspects. There's Wang, which is the empowerment, where the the energy to be able to use these practices effectively is transmitted to the disciple by the master. The lung, which is the reading transmission, the oral transmission of the text or the mantra or whatever, and then the tree, which is like the instructions for how to do it and when to do it and what posture to sit in and all this kind of stuff that goes with it. So once you have those instructions, then you can use these different mantras and different practices. They're usually not standalone, but part of a larger practice atmosphere or practice method, which is usually called a sadhana. So once you have those, then you can make these decisions. Usually you make them in relationship with your teacher and say, like, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? They're like, oh yeah, that's a good time for you, because the teacher is not as emotionally involved in your life as you are. So you might think like, I got to destroy this person. That's usually not a good thing to be trying to do. And your teacher might be able to say, actually, it's not that, it's this. And so it's always good to have someone, that you rely on, who's you feel is more advanced in the path than you. A qualified teacher is good. To help you decide what to do. But you are absolutely right that these things can be used for our own development. And ultimately, we're the ones who are going to decide what to do with them.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking, there's a lot of practitioners these days who maybe received empowerments online from Garchen Rinpoche or Dalai Lama, and they don't have their Lama to consult in person. And that's sort of one of the functions of our group, Denver Dzogchen, is to be like a community of practitioners, some of whom are very experienced, so that we can bounce ideas off of each other and really like get some of these questions answered. Because yeah, like it's a weird world we live in, right? Like Nyingma started off like you would be like you and like 5-10 other students who lived with a lama, or at least in close proximity, and they would be knowing you personally, and they would be guiding you with specific practices tailored specifically to you. That's just out of reach for most of us. And even if you do have contact with a lama, the way the Dharma is presented now is just not like that. The Lama tends to have like kind of a regimented monastic approach to the Dharma, where you kind of go through almost a collegiate approach to you do this and then you do that. And it's kind of this uniform for everybody. So I think that this is something interesting for us to explore as modern practitioners of this path. And having a group like Denver Dzogchen is really special, because we're able to start to like, how do we make these decisions for ourselves, because we're not going to get that one-on-one guidance. Because even if, in my experience, I've talked to my lamas and they don't always give the clearest advice, and they don't always know us that well. Even if we know them, peripherally, they don't know us outside of the context of like teachings, right? So, which is only very one-sided view of us.
Beautifully said. And for more experienced practitioners and just people who are interested in this path, it is a little bit of I hate to say unfortunate, because we're so blessed to even have this as an option in our world, right? If the Chinese had not invaded Tibet, the Tibetans wouldn't have fled. And if they hadn't had the diaspora, we wouldn't have met the lamas. At least in my case, that's probably really true. So the outcome of that has been that we have been able to connect with this path. But you're absolutely right. There are not that many great masters, and fewer. Most of the really super hot shots who were born in Tibet and trained in Tibet have left us, unfortunately. Some of their children and other tulkus, the tradition's still very much alive, but there are not that many qualified teachers, and they are very popular. If you look at someone like my own teacher, Tulku Urgyen's son, Tsokynyi Rinpoche, he's got millions of followers. And not all of them are really his students, but it's so he's so popular that he's going to give a retreat here in Colorado in August. And at least a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, they sent out an application, and if you wanted to go, you had to fill out the application, and then there was a lottery to decide who could go. This is tough. And then let's say there are 250 people there. To have private time with the master, probably almost impossible. I myself have known Tsokynyi Rinpoche for 25 years, almost 30 years. And I was in Nepal last year, and I had contacted him beforehand. And he said, yeah, come out, we can hang out, whatever. I went to his monastery, and it was me and like 30 other people. It was just the way it was. So you're absolutely right. So we really need This is kind of for people who are really into it. If you're just getting started, it's a different thing. But people like you yourself, it's good to have someone in between the master and yourself. And that person would be a Kalyanamitra, right? A spiritual friend, someone who maybe has more experience than you do, has more, you feel has more insight or whatever. And they can help you make decisions about what way you're going to go with your path. Because once you start with the outer nundro, then you do the inner nundro, and that takes some years. Then, usually there's a yidam practice, a sadhana practice, like we're talking about, visualization and mantra recitation. You do some amount, and then you do a fire puja at the end, or whatever the tradition recommends. When you finish that, what are you supposed to do, right? Do you do more mantra practice, and which ones? And it is nice to have somebody who is maybe not your guru, but is someone who you can look up to and get some information from, which is sort of the situation in our little group, which is so nice, because otherwise, how could you say you take the Dalai Lama as your guru? I mean, you could write a lot of letters before getting a response, and he doesn't know you, even if he does respond. So these days, it's nice to have a Kalyanamitra. If you don't have that, or you can't find that, then you have to make your own decisions. Ultimately, the spiritual path is about you, right? Oneself. And we are responsible. The guru is not responsible, right? We are responsible for our path. And even if we say, well, that person's my guru, it's not usually the case that the Lama says, I'm your Lama. Usually you decide that's my Lama, and then there becomes a relationship. So yeah, this is one of the aspects of the Vajrayana, which is really a little bit challenging these days. It is difficult to see the Lama, and the old time, at least our idea of how it was in the original days, where you just had a small group, or just Naropa and Tilopa, just two people, that is almost impossible now. And so we have to have a more modern approach. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out as practitioners in our modern world.
Yeah. Well, I totally think that, not that everybody needs to join Denver Dzogchen, although you could if you are interested. Is to create these kind of groups. Then I think this is the future of Sangha. Like, I can jump on my phone at any time, and I get on WhatsApp and I say, hey Joe, what do I do? I had this experience, and you're able to respond to me, and me, and we've gotten to know each other really well, and you can respond to these questions. I can't tell you how much that does for my path. So I just want to encourage people, find resources like this. There are old time now Western practitioners, and we don't have this tradition of lamas, and it's rare that Westerners are made lamas, and even if they are, they often don't keep that title, and so using your discernment as a practitioner, I think it can be really helpful. Just like, find somebody who's been around for a long time and pick their brain, and see if you can find somebody who has been on this path for a while to help you in a more personal way. I can't tell you how beneficial that can be for your path, because otherwise you're just relying on books. And I got to tell you, they're not always helpful, because they're just giving the same answers to everybody, and it's totally unpersonalized, and it's usually highly conceptual, and that can be a really impediment to the path. I think that one of the interesting things of Secret Mantrayana is it's a kind of relationship path, right? Like, we have a relationship to the Yidam, we have a relationship to our guru, we have a relationship to the protectors. It's relational, not intellectual, which maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's something I haven't considered very much. To go to what you said before, I like to use the word Kalyanamitra because it's a cool Sanskrit word, but what it really is a spiritual mentor. And I do recommend that if you're on this path, it's good to have. It's good to try to connect with people who you can benefit from. I mean, I have lots of friends like this, and they act as mentors for me. Maybe they've been around longer, maybe they speak Tibetan perfectly, so they have a different understanding of the culture than I do, because my Tibetan is terrible. This kind of stuff. Plus, it's someone, as you said, to bounce ideas off. Like, hey, I really feel like doing this. How would you recommend that I get involved with it? One of my spiritual mentors is Jean-Luc Archard, a great French translator, and an amazing being who has been so incredibly helpful to me. And I recommend to everyone who's interested in this stuff, he has a review I can't remember the French name of it, but it's like Tibetan Review, and he runs that for the French government. And they put out so many interesting articles I think it's quarterly now. And it's all available online, just a recommendation. But I've learned, if I'm reading something in there or in another source, and I'm like, well, how does this relate to my practice? I can reach out to someone who has more experience than I do, or maybe they just know more about the tradition. Jean-Luc's a good example because the guy seems to have read every Tibetan text, everything. He seems to know everything. Another person that I've related to a lot is Erik Drew, who is a real yogi and spent his entire early life growing up with the 16th Karmapa and other great masters. And just being able to relate to someone who's, from your perspective, and that's the most important thing, it's really up to you, is more advanced than you are or further along the path, whatever that means, is so helpful to us. So just that's in its own parentheses, is that kind of relationship can be really helpful. It doesn't mean that person is your guru, right? They can be your friend. It's okay. And their encouragement can be very supportive. That's the kind of situation I recommend. What was part 2?
Just how the Vajrayana is a relational path rather than a conceptual.
That's beautifully said and super interesting. There's some pretty profound things. I realized a few years ago, now it's maybe 10 years ago, that the transmission and relationship you have with your teachers, whoever you're defining as your teachers, your lama, your spiritual mentors, even your fellow students, there is a potential for change in that doesn't exist if you're doing it by yourself. It's really, although all spiritual paths, you're really on your own in a sense, Sangha is one of the 3 jewels, right? We need that relationship. We need that connection. It accesses something an aspect of ourselves that you can't do on your own. There are so many texts. Just think of like what's been every year. I can't keep up with it, right? I used to feel that I had read everything in my particular area of interest. That hasn't been the case for 15 years now. There's just material coming out every single day. There's so many qualified translators and so many texts are being translated. If you just look at Lotsawa House, every week there's more stuff on there. It's not possible to process through all this material, A, and then B, as you very nicely said, the spiritual path is not an intellectual path, really, at its heart. We are very intellectual beings, and so we must apply our intellect to whatever we're doing. If we don't do that, it's the kind of thing where you check your mind at the door, and that leads to a lot of confusion. Look at our world, right? This is all people who are very intelligent with crazy ideas as a result of, a little disconnect there, in my opinion. But ultimately, the spiritual path is not an intellectual thinking. It's not about thinking. It's about what is behind the mind, discovering what is before our intellectual interpretation of the world and abiding within that and learning to live from there, changing our allegiance, so I guess you could say, from Sem, the dualistic mind of confusion, to awareness. And that journey is the spiritual path, right? And it's so much easier to do if you can get out of your head and into a relationship with someone. That can be a spiritual friend who's on the same path. That could be a mentor like we're talking about, and they don't even have to be in your tradition. I throw out another name of someone who's been really helpful to me, Father Francis Tiso. He is a Buddhist scholar, but he's a Catholic priest, and I grew up in a Catholic household, and I was a Catholic for an early part of my life, and I still have great appreciation for Christianity generally and the Catholic faith to some degree. And I've learned so much from him, and he's not even a Buddhist, right? It doesn't have to be someone in your tradition. It has to be someone that you feel you can learn from. And this is true in all areas, but on the spiritual path, really necessary. Otherwise, it's all in your head, and you're trying to think your way through something that is really beyond thinking. The goal is beyond thinking, the path is beyond thinking, even the foundation is beyond thinking. which is very difficult to connect with if you're doing it all yourself through books. So yeah, always good to reach out. Very well said. Very interesting about the mentorship aspect. And I'll say one more thing. What occurred to me some years ago in a little minor flash of insight is that some of the Dharma, I don't know if this is true for other religions, I imagine it is, but I say from my perspective, because it's a Buddhist perspective, some of the Dharma can only be accessed through that relationship. You can't, I don't want to say you can't do it on your own, but it's much more easily connected with. There's a kind of magic in the transmissional aspect, and the transmission both ways, right? The teacher learns from the student. I know that's the case because since I've been forced to do this teaching stuff, I have learned so much. I thought that when Anzum Rinpoche told me to start this group, it was because I could help others. Then I realized midway through the first minute I started to do it, that it was actually for me. I was the one who was going to benefit from this. But it's two ways, right? The teacher learns from the student, and the student also learns from the teacher. And the interaction creates another aspect of learning, which is really special. Hard to talk about and really, really special.
Yeah, what the thing I put together. So Garchen Rinpoche is always talking about love. Well, what is love? Love is that connection, right? So when he's saying, like accomplishing the yidam is complete love for the yidam. When our heart is totally open to something, then there's no separation, right? The connection is there. That's why all the texts and great masters have said it's so important who your teachers are, and it's so important who your students are, and it's so important who you hang out with, because it literally, more than any book you'll read or teaching you go to, your relationships, whether they be to people or to gurus who are no longer in a body, or to yidams or to protectors or whatever, those relationships are really what transform us. Like I know in myself, like I can't think myself to change, but if I hang out with different people and connect to different people or connect to different beings, it changes who I am fast, like really fast, for good or ill. And so that connection, that love, that's why I think Garchen Rinpoche is always talking about love, because it's that connection that is so important and transforms us. And we can harness that through, and that's why Samaya is so important. It's preserving that love, because the moment we end that love, then we've cut the connection, and severed connections are incredibly destructive. So we want to preserve love no matter what decisions we make. So even if we have a teacher, let's say, and we decide that teacher's not right for us, we can preserve love and still walk away, right? We could still say, I'm done with this relationship because it's not serving me, but I'm not going to cut off my love, because that would cut off me from.
Well said. I think that there's a whole topic you can talk about with interactions with gurus that don't work for you and stuff. That's a whole thing maybe we'll talk about in the future, because it's important these days. But what is happening from my perspective in what you're talking about in that relationship is an openness, a vulnerability. And that's very difficult to do on your own, right? And if you are not vulnerable, then change can't occur. We're like an ice block, to use Garchen Rinpoche's term he's always using, right? And it's only the love aspect that can melt the ice block. It's only our own vulnerability, our own openness, the whole spiritual path starts because you recognize you want to change. This situation is intolerable, right? You might think sarvam dukam dukam, everything is suffering, or you might have some other way of putting it to yourself, but there's a sense of like, I have to do something. If you already had all the answers, then there would be no openness there. But when you learn to relax that aspect of yourself that has become so solidified, that's when the change can take place. In fact, that relaxation, that openness, that vulnerability is directly related to, if not identical with, the transference of blessings from the Buddhas to us. And so I absolutely agree with you that in these relationships, and everybody needs a Sangha. Even if you're on retreat alone in the mountains, you still need a Sangha. And that Sangha might be the objects in your room. It might be the birds and animals that eat the offerings that you make to the protectors or whatever it happens to be. And if you're in a situation like in the world where most practitioners are, then with your Dharma brothers and sisters, with your mentors, with your gurus, you need to have this relationship with the Yidams. And that relationship is all about love, which is all about vulnerability. So I think that's interesting, you know?
Yeah, and another name for that in this specific context, of course, is devotion, right? And there's the analogy of the cup, right? The cup that's upside down, which you're closed and you're not receiving anything. There's a cup that has a crack in it, which means that you're not preserving what you're receiving. And then there's the cup that has poison in it, where you're mixing negativity or negative thoughts with whatever you're receiving. But what we want to be is a pure, clean vessel so that the blessings can pour into us. And that's that vulnerability you're talking about. It's a vulnerable position to be an open cup. We're often trained to not be open cups in this modern world, and often for good reason. But a huge part of the Mahayana is slowly turning that cup open.
Absolutely. I mean, exactly right. You mentioned devotion, and devotion and compassion are pretty much the same thing. It's just if you feel that the object of this, it's all based on love. The object of this love is I don't know if I should say superior to you, further along the path, more developed, whatever you want to call it, then your relationship to that being is one of devotion. If the being is looking to you as the support, as the one to help guide them and so forth, then your relationship of love is compassion. And sometimes they go back and forth, right? I'm working with a guy in federal prison who's been in there for a long time, and he's been my student for probably coming up on 5 years. And oftentimes when we talk, I am instructing him, and sometimes when we talk, he is instructing me. He is in a much more intense environment and is practicing an incredible amount. We could have a whole discussion about this guy. It's like amazing. I feel so much. I feel compassion for his situation, but I also feel devotion for his incredible connection to the path and his unstoppable bodhicitta. It's like in such a ridiculously harsh and terrible environment, he's still doing it. It's incredible. In fact, he's just about to finish his 5th Nundro. Can you believe that? 5th Nundro. I'm like, wow. I mean, I thought I did the Nundro a lot, and I only did it 4 times. And he's not only finishing his 5th one, he's already got his 6th one. He already received the oral transmission for doing the 6th one. I was like, wow, it's like Milarepa. So sometimes I only bring him up because he brings a lot of, I have a lot of love for him. And it's a love that's sometimes devotional and sometimes compassionate, because our relationship is mixed. And this is how it is probably in all spiritual relationships. We have some to learn. It doesn't matter if the person, doesn't know anything. I can still learn from them. And even if I'm relating to a great being, my openness has something to teach too. So it's a balance, right?
Totally. Well, I think this is great. And I think we've reached probably the end of our time, but I'll plant a seed. So for next podcast, what I wanted to talk about is what's typically called visualization. But you were told by one of your teachers to think of it as feelingization, which I think will connect to, because I know tons of people struggle with this aspect of the Vajrayana, which is such a huge part of it. And I think it all connects to what we've been talking about with love and connection and feeling and relationships. So, but yeah, is again, as always, wonderful to talk with you. And thank you so much, all of you, for listening to us and following our podcast. Please like, subscribe, comment, all those things that help our podcast reach other people. We appreciate your support. If you're interested in Denver Dzogchen, which we meet weekly online every Tuesday evening, you can go to denverdzogchen.com and find the link there. And it also has the link to our podcast, where you're probably watching this on YouTube or Spotify, all the major podcast hosting sites. And I just encourage you to get connected. And if you're interested in Denver Dzogchen and working with our group, then great, connect there. If not, find your local Sangha, and find those practitioners who've been around for a while and make some relationships, because I think it can really benefit your path, make it so much more rich, so much more that you can get from books. But as always, thank you. And this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Joe.
Pleasure.
See you next time. Signing off.
Thank you.